The last time we diagnosed a complex system as losing its observing ego, as one that stopped doing the labor that it needed to do to keep up, so things just rotted on the vine. And here's the part none of us wanted to hear. There's no one coming to rescue us. If we want these fields to be fruitful, we're going to have to plant and tend them ourselves. So that same system is still on the couch. Quick recap of the diagnostics. Every system, a mind, a government, the physical body, it survives on the parts staying in contact, able to connect with each other. I called that the integrative function. Part one was the diagnosis, what happens when it starts to fail. Today's question is the one we ended on. If the institutions can't do this job, then who does? And the uncomfortable answer is us. This episode, we're going to look at three different things. The dramatic fix, the one decisive moment when people reach that breaking point. How you get two sides back to the table when it appears they don't even speak the same language. And we're going to talk about one system that appears to integrate beautifully, but still can't save itself. We'll close on the star. And by the time we get to that card, you'll understand why it was chosen. You're watching The World on the Couch, where we put the daily news cycle through a psychological lens, because that's the part the news almost always misses. I'm Dr. Marlene Ryle. I'm a psychologist and a psychiatric nurse practitioner with 30 years of experience in the field. Before we diagnose this as simply a Washington problem, it isn't. The same pathology shows up in a number of other places. For example, it shows up in the healthcare system. The function of the primary doctor, the primary care physician, was supposed to be the integrative function. The one generalist who held all the information about your lab tests, every specialist you've been to, every drug you take. And those specialists only looked after one part of the body. Now that role gets at best a 15-minute visit that's paid by the encounter, paid by the CPT code. It's never paid for the synthesis. That was the whole point of what the primary care doctor was supposed to be. The connective tissue doesn't get reimbursed. You can't bill it. So it doesn't get done because they don't have time to do it. I'm not faulting the primary care physician because their whole role has been undermined. But it's even worse than what's been going on in government, because here these silos are kept apart on purpose because that fragmentation profits the insurance companies. The government shouldn't have that incentive. We'll talk about the healthcare system in its own episode. I'm just talking about one example. So to say that this isn't this isn't a political problem, this is a structural problem. Now, if the problem is just that the parts aren't connected, the obvious fix sounds like, well, connect them, merge them together, put one thing in charge of all of it. That's the wrong answer, because what we're talking about, diversifying and merging, those aren't the same as integration. One entity swallowing many functions is how corporations work. And at the end of the day, even though they say their shareholder is the first thing, it's really their own bottom line. That's the first thing. So diversification and consolidation are not the cure. It's the disease in another form. Consolidation collapses the parts into a single center with no independent voice left to say no, which is the very thing we've been warning about during the last episode. Integration is the other thing. It's not separate and siloed, not merged into one, differentiated parts held in obligatory contact. They stay distinct and they stay accountable to one another. And this is what the clinical model is. In the consulting room, growth isn't the strong part of you swallowing the weak part. It isn't the ego erasing the shadow. It's the parts learning to stay in conversation. A healthy mind isn't a mind with fewer parts. It's a mind with richer relationships among the parts it already has. Pema Chodron would call this giving everyone a seat at the table. Now, the civic version is the same. The answer here isn't a fourth branch of government, which I've heard from some podcasters and some experts. It's just another box. It's the branches actually doing what they're meant to do, which is to check each other. What's easy to forget here is that the separation of powers itself was an integrative function insight. The founder's instinct was right. Don't consolidate, distribute, force the parts to check each other. So, and the argument isn't that the founders got this wrong. It's that they got it right, and we stopped doing the thing that they got right. We welded the parts closed where they were supposed to move. So if the breakdown is this deep, if the integration function has failed so completely across all of it, the one temptation is very obvious, and that's, it's time for an intervention. One decisive moment, one actor who steps in and makes it right. In clinical terms, an intervention is something pretty specific, and the gap between the two meanings can be troublesome, because that fantasy decisive moment, this idea of one rupture, one person with the will to fix it all at once, it's a fantasy. It's the wish for version of how change works, the singular moment where we rise up and make this change. It's never a moment. It's not an event. It's a process. So large, complex systems can't be remade in a moment. They're like cruise ships. This thing with a lot of mass that you can't just turn on a dime. It takes time for that cruise ship to change direction. And it's like the fall of Rome. When people talk about the fall of Rome, it didn't happen in a day. It wasn't just, Rome burned and Nero fiddled. Rome, it took hundreds of years for Rome to eventually fall. And what came after was like a slow collision that nobody authored. So anyone promising you the single decisive moment is selling you a fantasy. And the acuteness of the crisis is not license to abandon the method. You don't perform major surgery on someone who's in shock. You have to stabilize that person. You have to assess them carefully. And you have to try not to do that dramatic thing right now all at once, because that's a symptom of the disease. So the intervention isn't the fast, total kind. It's the slow, unglamorous kind. Restoring the integrative function as a discipline. Differentiated parts back in accountable contact. It doesn't make a headline, but it's the only thing that's ever worked. How do we make the first move? If you can't rupture it, and you can't merge it, and you can't wait for one decisive moment, it actually starts before any structure, before any reform, before redesign. It starts with the parts agreeing that the contact is even legitimate. And what that means is that there has to be a shared reality worth paying attention to together. That's the integration function in its most minimal form. Two parts granting that the other one is real and has something valuable. And that's the thing that's gone. the silos, the binary, the system that can't turn, like they all bottom out in the same place. And the parts that won't grant that the other parts are real can't integrate. There's nothing to build on. So right now, this is not symmetrical. One part can want the conversation while the other part simply declines to have it. And how do you put someone who's left the table back into contact? A part that won't grant that the other parts are real isn't taking a political position. It's showing you a structure. It's a closed loop that only reflects itself. That, this is, you can't like argue a closed loop open. You can't drag someone back to the table. You have to keep the table standing so that when the closed loop fails, and they always fail eventually, there's something to come back to. I'm going to leave you with one example, which is for a future episode. There is one large-scale system built on the principle our institutions froze on. Differentiated parts held in accountable contact, growing in complexity to match its environment instead of locking at a fixed number. That's the architecture under AI, artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not holding up AI as the fix for this problem. I'm using it as a lens, as proof that something that can hold complexity in this way exists. But the one thing that makes this kind of a warning instead of a blueprint is that AI has an integrative platform with no observing function. There's no part that watches the self, that registers consequence, that refuses its own path. It runs down whatever path it's on with total fluency and no internal break. That break isn't inside the machine. It isn't inside AI. And AI, if you ask, would tell you so. Because the thing that makes AI accountable is the human who's using it. The complexity itself was never the hard part. The part that says no is actually the harder part. And that part was always supposed to be us. This show is like a small scale instance of like the thing the whole country needs. Naming dynamics so that we all get a shared language for what's happening. So it's sort of the couch scaled up. And there's a card for it, of course. And this card is from the Tower of the Spirit, and it is the Star. Now, most star cards have a woman who's holding two urns. And this card sits in the major arcana in between the Tower card, the Destruction card, and then the Moon. The Star is coming right after the Tower, after the structure comes down, and before the Moon, before the dark stretch. So this is not the light at the end of the tunnel. This is the first star you see after it all goes south. This is the hope that arrives early in the process. Something to the light to walk by, the light to the stars that light your way. Now, this particular deck draws it without that single figure. There's a 7-pointed star at the center, and then the same pattern repeats above and below it, which is the same forms held in a mirror. The oldest esoteric principle, as above, so below. The pattern at the top and the pattern at the bottom are the same pattern at different scales. And then there's this channel running right down the center, this, the upper to the lower, this white column running down the center. These two scales aren't just alike, they're connected, and they keep the above and the below in contact, because that is the integrative function. It's drawn as like a cosmology centuries before anyone called it that. It doesn't live in one place. It's the same structure of accountable relation holding at every scale. The psyche and the country are the same pattern at different magnitudes. And the reverse is just as true. The closed loop, a part that only reflects itself, is going to fail at every scale too. It can't take anything in outside itself. So it has nothing to correct by. And it collapses under its own weight. And this isn't a prediction. This is just the structure doing what the structure does. And it's why these structures ultimately collapse, because they're meant to. That's why the work doesn't have to start at the top to be real, because the small instance and the large one are the same shape. As above, so below. The integrative function is the same pattern. And it doesn't only belong to the institutions. It belongs to us. I'm going to say it again. It belongs to us at our scale. This card sits right after the collapse, before the darkness clears. The star is not a promise that the hard part is over. It's the light you walk by. Well, it isn't. And it starts with just two people agreeing to look at the same reality and to tell each other the truth about it. That's the smallest instance of the thing that this entire country needs. That's the couch. Thank you for watching. I'm Dr. Marlene Ryle, and the couch is always open.